Good afternoon again, everybody. Welcome to our open office hour series on NetSuite. Today, the topic is SuiteFlow. We'll cover different areas of creating and maintaining workflows. During our invitation, we did forget to ask for your specific questions like we always do. So we received some feedback last night, but if you have any questions, anything you would like us to cover, please post it on the Q&A area of Zoom, and we will do our best to answer the questions, or if not, we'll follow up with you after the meeting. Thank you very much, and we'll get started. So again, the topic today is workflows, and I like to start sort of with the basics. I'm logged into my NetSuite account, and depending on how you have your permissions set up, we will start with the how you enable the workflows. So first, let me enable the workflow here and show you where that is. I'm going to change to my administrator role. And my administrator role, the way where if you don't have the feature enabled, you first come to company enable features, and under the Suite Cloud tab, you're going to have a checkbox here for SuiteFlow. Depending on your edition of NetSuite, it may have come already enabled. If not, you can always come here and enable it. And when you do, you're going to get a pop-up that talks about the Suite Cloud terms of service. You'll be forced, you'll have to accept them, basically, and it basically tells you some of the things that SuiteFlow does and how it creates code in your account. And then you just click save here, enable features, and you're on your way. The next thing I want to discuss is there's one preference regarding workflow, and if you come to here to set up accounting preferences, there are some workflows that are native to NetSuite without creating your custom workflow, and those are going to be, for example, a purchase order workflow has a standard workflow that comes out of the box. But if you want to create or use SuiteFlow to use your own personalized workflow, then you want to come here to this approval routing section in accounting preferences and select the workflow that you want to select, that you're going to use a personalized or customized workflow for. In this case, I have one for vendor bills that I'm going to set up. I'm going to do one more quick thing here that I just noticed, and then we will go into the actual workflow. So let me go to a specific workflow here, and I'm going to go to creating a new workflow. So let's just pretend, for example, that I want to create a workflow where when I have my enter bills screen, I want to make a field mandatory. So we'll start with that, and as we go through the creation of the workflow, I'll talk about the different fields and different settings of the workflow that we want to care about. And let's say that I want to make sure that this due date field is mandatory. The reference number. I'm going to use the reference number, which is the invoice number for your vendors, is mandatory. So the way you would approach that is via a workflow. There's a couple of ways you can do it through a customization of the form. There's a checkbox for that, so that's probably the easiest way. But sometimes you want to do something a little bit more complex or mandatory based on other criteria. So I'll use that as a basic example. And what you would do is you would come here to customization, workflows, and I'm just going to first go to the page where you see all the workflows that I have created, and going to walk quickly through that. Here you have all the workflows that you have in your account, and you have the ability to filter this by record type. We'll see about that, about who created the workflow, who owns it. So you can discuss if you want to talk to somebody about somebody who created their own workflow. If the workflows are released or not, so basically are they running or not, and some workflows come from bundles, meaning they were installed from a package from a third party, or maybe a project you did in your sandbox and bundle into production. So you can do all this filtering here to look at your workflows. So then to get started with the workflow, it's a simple, you create a new workflow. You can create a workflow from a template. So there are some basic templates that are in NetSuite, a journal entry, basic approval workflow, one for a purchase order, for sales orders and lead nurturing. But you're not limited to those. Those just give you a starting point. But I'm gonna start a workflow from scratch, and I'm gonna call this workflow make reference field mandatory. We always recommend that you give your workflows an ID so that you can find them easily or use them in scripting and not just have the ID number that NetSuite automatically gives the workflow. So I'm going to give it, workflow mandatory. The first thing you'll see that's mandatory here is that you have to define where you want to run this workflow. More and more, NetSuite allows workflows to be run in every record, whether it's standard or custom, a custom record. So you can choose the transaction or the record that you want to run this on. So in this case, I want to run it on a transaction. And when I select transaction, if there's multiple transaction types, like in this case, there are transaction types, you select what you want to run it on. So in this case, I want to run it on a vendor bill. You always recommend that you give your workflow a description. So the description will be makes reference number mandatory. You define who the owner is. If you want your workflow to make sure that it executes, that it has no permission restrictions, you can click execute as administrator. So you'll have to check with your, sometimes with your auditors, they don't like this feature because it gives the user power to basically do anything in the system. But you also want to make sure that if your permissions are not, at the state where you want them to be, where maybe the person doesn't have access to a specific field or a specific transaction, or you're doing something via import and they don't have access to the transaction, there's different reasons why you might want to run it as an administrator. Typically, I always check this unless I'm being told by the client not to, because there's really no harm in doing that. Then next, you can set the release status. This means, whether you have a workflow that you're testing and this will only run when the owner is testing it. Release means that it's released for everybody that you have assigned this workflow to run for. And then you have suspended if you want to stop it or not initiating sort of the new ways that NetSuite has it of not running the workflow. And then you can keep an instance of the workflow in history. So logging, you can keep it only when testing. Maybe you don't want to, fill the account with all the logs and all the instances that are running of the workflow. You want to make sure that a new instance is run every time, or you want to always keep it, and then you can always enable logging. And enable logging allows you to troubleshoot if something is going wrong. Eventually, if you're comfortable with the workflow, we recommend disabling enable logging, because again, it just accumulates more information, and information takes up space in the database, etc. So it depends on your preference for that. And finally, obviously, you can always make a workflow inactive. So in this case, I'm just going to have it as testing, and I'm going to keep it as always for logging. Then when you come to the initiation of the workflow, initiation basically means when the workflow is going to kick in, when it's going to work and do what you need it to do. And you have two options. One is event-based, so when something else happens, or you can do it scheduled. And schedule just means it's based on the trigger is going to be based on a specific safe search. So you have a filter, so it knows what to run on, because it's not an event. It's not working when you're actually doing something in the UI. You might want to do it for something specific. For example, you may want an invoice to be updated with a comment every time the status changes to paid. You may want a field that captures the paid date. So you may want to do that as event-based, so it runs automatically in the background, or you may say, once a day, I want all my invoices to be updated based on the certain criteria. So you create a safe search that defines the criteria, and that safe search is going to trigger, the workflow is going to run on the results of that safe search. And then you can trigger that when you want it daily, every 30 minutes is the quickest as far as scheduled, you know, and a beginning and end date that you may want to start, you may want to use for that workflow. In this case, I'm going to trigger it as an event based, because I want to do it when I create when I enter a vendor bill, right? So then the next thing, when you create an event base, you see that you get all these fields to select or to drive your workflow. The first one's going to be, you know, do you want to trigger this only when you're creating, or when that transaction or that record, or do you want to create it only when you're viewing or updating that record, or always? So depending on your workflow, you want to do it, you know, you may want to do it in both. You may want to set it in both. You want to make sure that the field is set mandatory when you're creating the vendor bill. So you may just want to create it on create, or you may want to do it where it's always mandatory. Let's just make sure that every time, you know, it runs. Again, if you have too many workflows, you have to be smart about the triggers, because every time the workflow runs, you know, the engine is running and it's just consuming resources. And every time a user is running, so the more users, the more workflows, you know, you want to be smart about that strategy. So I'm going to create it here just on create, and the next field is going to be the trigger type. So you can define 3 types of triggers, or you can select all. Again, depends on when you want it to trigger. The first one is before record load, and basically this is going to happen when you're loading that record, when you're loading the transaction or the entity record. The workflow is going to trigger at that point and started the trigger process. So it's going to go into that first entry state. The other one is before record submit. So after you hit save, but before the record is written in the database, is the other option. And then the third option is after record submit, which is after it saves in the database, it triggers the workflow. So this may be something that you want to happen, you know, on the server after it's saved, not something that you want. In this case, it wouldn't work, because I don't want a mandatory after I create the transaction. I want a mandatory before I submit it. So I could use either before record load or before record submit. So I'm going to just do it in this case before record load, and you have the option then to even go more detail into, you know, any of these event types, from creating or editing or, you know, viewing a record. I'm going to select, I'm not going to select any, which means that they're all, it's going to be applicable in all. And then you have the context, which is, do you want this workflow to run, you know, for only when you're using the UI, or you want it to run when you are creating a CSV import, for example, or when you're doing a bundle installation. It defaults to all. I typically, unless I know I wanted something specific, I will leave it at this, right? And then you can define conditions. So a condition can be, you know, only make it mandatory, for example, if the reference is empty. So I can say only run this workflow if the reference field is empty. I don't want it to run if it already has a value, because my point is to make it mandatory, right? And if it already has a value, then it serves its purpose. So you can define conditions here, and conditions can be, you know, you can use and/or conditions, so you can be complex conditions and to create your workflow. So I'm going to use a simple condition. Only do it if the reference is mandatory. And I'm actually going to change this to before record submit, because I have this condition here. Your condition can also be a safe search, right? So if you don't have a condition, but you want that is clear, but you want to run a more complex condition, you can create a safe search. And if there are no values in that safe search, then the workflow will not initiate. So once I've completed all this information, you know, I save, the header or the body of that workflow, and you can then go to, it's going to open the workflow engine itself, and it gets into the actual details of the workflow. So in this case, I have a one state. This is called a state of the workflow. And I'll show you later a workflow that has multiple states. It's more complex, but this is a simple workflow. Here you see what you entered before. This is sort of a summary of the workflow. And in this case, I'm gonna come into this state, and when I click on the state, you'll see that this changed to the state window, and it allows you to have actions. The first thing I always like to do, and I recommend, is that if you have a complex workflow, especially, you give your states a name. So I'm gonna say, make field mandatory, and you can give it a description if you want. You can have other things like, do not exit workflow in this state. You want to make sure that it continues to another state. And if there's transactions or transitions, or fields that are containing variables, and that's where you get into advanced workflow, not something we're going to cover today. You can put that here, and then you can have translations if you need to translate this. So I'm going to give this a name, and then I'm going to create a new action. And you have all these actions that you have available when you're creating a workflow. So from adding a button, to confirming something, to initiating another workflow. You may have a workflow that's triggered based on this workflow. You can send emails. You can remove a button that you may want to remove. For example, an approval button in a workflow for vendor bills. Or you can, in this case, set a field mandatory. So in this case, I'm going to set a field mandatory, and it's going to open the action window. Again, you give this an ID if you want to, field mandatory. You can, if you have multiple actions, you can order the action so that the order of your workflow makes sense. So you may want to make the field mandatory first before you do something else in the workflow if you have multiple actions. And we'll jump into another workflow that has multiple actions. You can define a trigger. So it defines for every action that you're creating, it already has a default trigger on. So I typically will not touch that. And you have, again, the actions are preset, and then you can define what field you want mandatory, and you can use a body field that you can make mandatory, or you can do a sublist field. And this is relatively newer. It's maybe a year and a half, if not a little bit more or a little bit less, where you can actually create workflows for sublist items of your transactions. It used to be where you could only create workflows for bodies of the transaction, so the main part of the transaction, not the lists like items or expenses in the transaction. So that's just something that you may want to. It should be only available or achievable via script. So now you may want to change some of your scripts to workflows, just because workflows are a little bit lighter in what they consume, and more flexible for non-developers to create. So I have my select as a body, and the field that I want to create is reference number. So you have to have a very clear naming convention of your fields to be able to know what field you want. And it's very important, even though it's make field mandatory is the condition, you want to make sure you click this box which says to make it mandatory. Again, you can create conditions. And the reason for this is that sometimes you want to make a field mandatory based on another field being created, based on another field on the account, right? So, for example, you may want to have a condition where the reference field is only mandatory, if the approval status is not approved, for example, right? Pending approval. So you may want to have some conditions that are relevant based on other conditions. And what you do in that workflow is that you have to create the one for when it is true, make it mandatory, but another when it is not true, because maybe the field is populated, but then gets cleared by another user. So you want to make sure that if that field is clear, then there's a condition to make it non-mandatory. So you would uncheck that. So in this case, I do want a mandatory, so I'm gonna leave it checked. And once I have my conditions here, you can have multiple actions here. I'm ready to execute this workflow. We have somebody asked about a vendor bill approval workflow. So let's move on to that. And this is a vendor bill approval workflow where it's a little bit more complicated. You'll see here that it has sort of the same setup where we have the transaction selected as a transaction being the vendor bill. It's acting as an admin. It's enabling the login. It's created for all trigger types on create and on view or update. And it does have a condition, where the user, you want to make sure in this case that if you have a user, the supervisor is not empty, right? Because the workflow is going to trigger on the supervisor. It's going to be based on the fact that the employee has a supervisor to actually approve the workflow. And it does have a field that we're using here to record a list of vendor bill memos. So that it's a little bit more complex in that sense. And if you can see here, the workflow has a lot more conditions and actions than the other one. So for example, the first condition here is where you're telling the system, set the field called approval status to pending approval. So if we go to the transaction, the vendor bill that we were on, you have a field called pending approval, right? So you're telling the first thing, you want to make sure that every bill is created with a pending approval status. So you can select, in this case, the type of workflow action is set field value and not set field mandatory. So I'm setting the field, you have to select what field, and you have the option of selecting a static value. Where if it's a field, if it's a list, you're gonna have to select it from a list. If it was a text field, you can select you can put a specific text, or if it's a checkbox, you can make it checked. Obviously, if it's a date field, you can select a date, and you can also select fields from other records. So in this case, it's not applicable, but if you want to populate a field based on a field on the vendor record, for example, vendor category, for example, you can set up that field and then make it flow directly from the field, or you can even use a formula. So in this case, I have a static value pending approval. This is the first action. The second action is I'm telling the system there's a next approver field. I want to make sure that the next approver field is hidden. In this case, is set the display type, set it to hidden. So I'm not setting the value. I'm saying do not show that field. So if you look at here, there's no field called next approver on this workflow. So that's another action type, maybe hiding a field based on just hiding it or based on a condition, right? So fields are only available, and then you can make them mandatory if certain conditions are met. And this is practical maybe when you wanna have your users populate a field for a specific customer, but you don't want them to populate it for other customer types in a customer record or in an invoice. Instead of creating multiple forms, you can use a workflow to use less forms and more variability using the workflow. The third is to say I'm setting another display type. When I'm making that field, this approval workflow disabled. So instead of having it where they can change it, I'm having it disabled so the user cannot change this to approved. So that's another action that I have here. And then, this is when the workflow starts, and then when this state exits, when there's an exit action, then I want to make sure that the next approver field is disabled. It's not showing, but I want to make sure it's disabled so it cannot be changed. And I have another condition, which is, set on before record submit, where I want, even though the field is disabled and hidden, I do want to set the next approver to be the supervisor of the user. So this is an example where you're taking a field, next approver, and you're setting it from another field, right? So NetSuite validates that the field types match. This next approver on the field itself is a field that is of a list type employee. You made it not a text field, but a list type of employees when you created that field, or when the workflow creates that field from the bundle. So I want to populate it using the user, and then here the field that is the user that's creating that specific bill. And then I want to I have all these options from the user record, from the employee record. These are all the fields that I have actually option to select. So maybe you have another field that you created on your employee record called vendor bill approver. So you have your native expense approver, your native purchase approver, your native time approver, and your native supervisor. But maybe you want a workflow that the vendor bill approver is completely different than the purchase approver. So you would create that field as a custom field on your employee record, and you would have it here. In this case, I'm using the supervisor. So I'm gonna say, okay, nothing's changed, so it's gonna be okay. So then, you have that first action, which is validating the bill. From here, you have all the different transitions out of this workflow. So one transition goes to the bill. This is a standard workflow in NetSuite that I've customized, but you can get it as a suite, as a bundle, and I'll get to that in a second. But you have the option of having different transitions. In this case, the transition is if there's a bill PO amount exception. And this is basically it's the start of a three-way match workflow. And you can see that there's a condition to transition to this flow, to this state, based on a safe search, right? So you can make transitions into multiple states. You see here, this workflow can transition here. It can go all the way to this PO partial received quantity exception, or it can come to the quantity exception based on the bill and PO. So these are all based on safe searches that NetSuite in the bundled workflow has created. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you transition between different roles. And you can see this is a kind of drag and drop where you can create more states and then join them by drag and drop. The condition that I'm going to concentrate on today is this vendor bill standalone condition. So if the vendor bill is created from a PO, all these three conditions apply. But if the vendor bill is created directly without a purchase order, meaning it has not been approved in a purchase order before, then I have this condition to transition directly to the approval queue. And that's my condition here. Before I get there, you'll see that when I open the vendor bill state, the state before in my previous workflow, I have all the actions here. You have all the transitions here. So it's a summary. You can see it all in one place, and any fields that you may have, you're using it here. And you can have here as a start state as well. NetSuite knows it's the first. If it's a start state, it is not the workflow exit state. So, so my conditions are met, I've defined, and my actions are defined in this workflow. And then I'm going to come to my approval workflow, where it's actually going to set up the approval process for me. And so here I'm validating again that the approval is still pending approval. So I want to make sure that before I actually create the buttons, it's set up as pending approval. And I am also setting the next approver an email. So this is another action that you can set up, where you can set up a send email action. And again, you can create conditions. All these are always the same. and you can define, who the sender is on the email. So you can define that as a specific person. You can define it as the user, from field user. So you have different options. In this case, I have it hard coded to come from Catherine Glass. You may want all the emails to come from this administrator. You have a recipient, so you can define the recipient of that email, and the recipient can be a specific recipient if all the vendor bills are going to one person, or a free-form address if you want to send it to somebody external to NetSuite, or you can do it from a field. So in this case, I'm sending it from the next approver field. So I want it to always go to the next approver, and that is because you may have multiple stages of approval. You may have, if it's less than 500, go to person A. If it's more than 500, go to person B. Or within the same workflow, you may have, the first approval is the department manager. The second approver is the CFO, for example. So depends on your workflow. You define that next approver field, and it's dynamic. It can be updated in every state of the workflow. And then you can obviously then define the email. So I can have a template that says, a predefined template that I can create using my email templates here under documents, or I can just hard code what I want. In this case, I am saying just vendor bill requires approval, and I'm saying please approve vendor bill number, and then you can use the transaction ID from the transaction as a dynamic field using just the internal ID of the field. And I could create a lot more text here if I wanted to, more dynamic text. And then you can always say whether you want a link from, you want a link from to be included in the email. And then if you want to include attachments, you can include attachments from a specific field. So you can create a custom field where you attach a document, not necessarily the drag and drop functionality or the file cabinet or file subtab, but a custom field, or you can include a specific even transaction inline. So this is the email action that I have here. And then once I have the email action as well, this is on entry. So as soon as it enters the state, this is what entry means, not the transaction, but as soon as it transitions from here to here, it's going to do these two actions. And and because the workflow is going to be on this state, then when the record loads, because the workflow again is already here, then you want to create the buttons. So right now you can see there are no buttons for approval or rejection here, but I have a condition that says add a button condition that if the vendor bill enters the state and the user is the next approver, not anybody. So I can create the user as the next approver, or I can say, user is the next approver, or the user role. For example, I'm going to make it the user role is administrator. So maybe you want the administrator to have a superpower or the user role is CFO, for example. So CFO, no matter who the bill is, the CFO always can approve it. So you can create these types of conditions. And I'm going to do it for the approve, but not for the reject, so you can see the difference. And then you give your button a name, right? So in the reject, I only have next approver, so only the next approver can reject the bill. And then you have your action, right? Your actions are going to be if the approver or the administrator pushes the reject bill button, then it's going to come to this rejected state, and it's going to set up the status to reject it, and it's going to create another button called Resubmit for approval. I don't have an email here, but I could have an email going back to the creator of the vendor bill saying your vendor bill has been rejected. You can add a rejection reason, for example, so you could do a lot of other things here. If the vendor bill is approved, so if this other condition where it's approved, you can see now that it's executing an approved bill, and then it's going to come to this state. This state is going to have a status of approved, and I can also have an email button called an email that emails the user that is being approved. out of this rejected button, I have another state called that to go back to the start if the user clicks resubmit for approval, right? So if I'm the user and I update the vendor bill after it's been rejected, I could automatically have it resubmitted when I save it, or I may want to review something, so I want to control when it's resubmitted for approval, and it'll go back to the start and execute all this again when the vendor bill is resubmitted for approval. So I'm going to come to my workflow now that it's been all explained. I can go back to my workflow, and I'm going to put my reference number here, office hours 011. I'm going to create my vendor. I'm going to select my vendor, Econ Business Solutions, and I'm going to create the location. Select the location here. You can see that I still cannot change this, and I'm going to select my again my category. This is for copies for $15, and I want this approved. So as soon as I save this bill, the workflow is going to run. And it's going to do what the workflow is intended to do in this case. The first thing that you'll notice is that it's going to have a status of pending approval here. The next approver has been assigned as Larry Nelson. And if I go to Catherine Glass's employee record here, you'll see that the supervisor for Catherine in the employee record is Larry Nelson. Larry Nelson is the supervisor. So now that's why that showed up. You can see that only the approve bill button is showing, because as the administrator, even though I'm not Larry Nelson, we modify the workflow so I can always approve it. So I could click here. Obviously, this is not the ideal situation because I am also the person that created the bill, but usually the person that created the bill would not be an administrator. So Catherine Glass would not have this button if she was not an administrator. So now if I move and I change roles and I come to the role of Larry Nelson, I log in as Larry Nelson, I have this bills to approve list here where I have all the bills that I can approve. And if I click here, because you have a custom workflow, then the view is going to be of, you select your workflow that you have. You only have usually, hopefully, just one, and any bill that's in that workflow is going to show up here. If you had multiple workflows for multiple situations, you could have different drop downs here. But here I'm gonna, in this case, I have the approved bill, so I could approve them all here as Larry Nelson, or I can come into this specific workflow that I just created and to just look into that, and I can then review the document if the document was attached. I could, or I can, in this case, approve or reject the bill. So in this case, I am going to just approve the bill. And that takes, that will set this vendor bill to status of open. I don't have permissions as a CFO to edit the bill, so my standard NetSuite permissions apply. I do have permissions to pay it. I don't have the permission to edit it. But if I go back to my administrator role here, and I go back to my vendor bill here that I just created, now I should see here that the vendor bill is approved and open. The buttons are not there anymore because the workflow makes the buttons to be removed. I could hide things like the status change to approved. I could have in my workflow conditions, for example, to hide this field or to remove Larry Nelson from it. but that won't show in Larry Nelson's queue anymore to be approved. And now I can see also in the system information tab, that there's that the workflow's executed, so it's ready to make the payment. So we have about 10 more minutes. So that's sort of a more complex workflows. Like I said, workflow can be as complex or as simple as you want them to. It all depends on what you want to do with the workflow. The important thing is that you really define the rules that you want. In this case, it was a very simple supervisor approval workflow, but you could have a workflow that looks at, for example, the location here, and looks and uses information in the location record to drive that approval. So for example, you may have in the location record, you may have a field that you create here where you create a location manager role. And you define a person here as the location manager, and every workflow, every bill that goes to location, sublocation 1 could be routed to the, instead of using the employee supervisor, you could use the location manager. And that way, if your location manager changes, you could have you as an administrator could come here, update your location manager, and immediately the next day, the next bill will be routed to that person. You could also have a location secondary approver, right? Where maybe it goes to 2 people. So you can make the workflow very dynamic. You can have it where it goes first to the location manager and then to a CFO based on the location manager's amount. So on that location manager, you could have, again, you can have another field here that says location manager's approval amount is 500. So if it's less than 500, that he can approve it, but if not, it still has to go to the other, to the CFO. So very, very dynamic in what you can do, not only in approval workflows, but in any type of workflow where you can make fields mandatory based on other fields, where you can make fields hidden based on other fields. So there's a lot of dynamic information that you can use to drive your workflows. The last thing I want to cover is that there are some workflows that are available directly by NetSuite, that you can have a good starting point. So if you come to Suite Bundler and you look for, as an administrator, you have the permission to install bundles. There is a new there's the Suite Approvals product or Suite app bundle that NetSuite has provisioned, and it has approvals, standard approvals for multiple transaction types. It's sort of a suite to create approvals, and if you go to Suite Answers and you search Suite Approvals, you'll have a lot of information about Suite Approvals there that you can use to install the app and use it. So for example, using Suite Approvals, you can see that it's a standard, it has a lot of information what you can do, and it has, besides the specific templates that NetSuite has, Suite Approvals now has journal entry approvals for expense reports or purchase orders, for requisition, sales orders, vendor bills. And the nice thing about Suite Approvals, it's now coming with a traceability of, not only if you have multiple workflows, multiple approvals, it keeps a history of their approvals. Today, you can see that history in the actual user notes. If you come to the system notes, you can see when a specific, just by who changed the approval status, basically. If I look on the document status, you can look at that and say, well, it was Larry Nelson, right? When Larry Nelson approved it. But, that's just you have to come here with Suite Approvals. There is an approval workflow sub-tab that shows you the different approvers along the way, so you can see everything in one nice spot. So that's very, very useful. The other thing that it's useful now every NetSuite account, when you do your renewal, or when you get a new account starting at the beginning of this fiscal year for NetSuite, every user account comes with the Learning Pass. I don't know if you're familiar with this Learning Pass with the NetSuite Learning Portal, but you get one pass every time now when you renew your account or when you get a new account. And there are a lot of SuiteFlow courses there that you have SuiteFlow fundamentals, and you have SuiteFlow knowledge. You can get certified for SuiteFlow, and there's SuiteFlow and advanced SuiteFlow module. So there's a lot of SuiteFlow information you can find within your Learning Pass. So I really suggest that if you recently renewed, or when you go through your renewal, that you look into this, and we can help you with that as well, so that you can take the most advantage possible of NetSuite SuiteFlow. So I don't see any questions on the question and answer window. I'll stick around for a few more minutes. Thank you again for your attention. Hopefully you found this useful. I do apologize for that initial workflow mishap, but if you have any questions about any workflow, remember that we're here to help you. We're here to assist you with any questions you may have as your NetSuite partners. So reach out as needed so that we can make sure that you're using NetSuite to the most of its capacity. Again, thank you again for your time, and we'll look to see you next week. Yeah, so Suite Approvals is going to be, and I'll switch back to my account. If you're in your account and you come to Customization, Suite Bundler, Search and Install Bundles, and here under Keywords, search for Suite Approvals. And then you just click on the Suite Approvals link, and you'll have the ability to install the bundle. The next screen will take you to the install bundle page, and you just follow the prompts to install it.